It's a bit unstable, but.
Welcome to the last seminar of this semester. Today we have young Fredrik, who's a professor at the Department of Information and Media Studies. You will talk to us about immigration debate in the Scandinavian press. And so you have the floor.
Okay. It's a bit. Let's see. Thank you very much. I was a bit worried when I see these things, and I still am worried. What is this? Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm going to talk on the basis of a project in Bergen called SCANPUB. Is this normal? And what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of immigration the last 50 years in Scandinavia, because that maybe not be some. I think this is a bit disturbing, semi-disturbing. Let's give it a show. I'm not sure. Okay, I'm not really aware. Det er Keynote, det har et annet system. Jeg vet ikke hvorfor det ser ut som det virker, så det å kobles ut. Jeg har det på Mac med USB-C, men det har ikke. Har du USB-C? Okay. Okay, so sorry about this, but I'm going to talk a few minutes about immigration history in Scandinavia, because maybe not everybody is just very familiar with this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of the usual tale about the Danish being quite strict on immigration, the Swedish being a kind, and Norway some kind in the middle. And I'm going to talk mainly about two small studies, and the one is a kind of content analysis of European coverage of the refugee crisis in 2015. Just to give some kind of idea if Scandinavia is different than the other countries, and in what way. And then I'm going to talk for most of the time about trends in the Scandinavian material, about how has immigration coverage changed from in the last 50 years, what are kind of the long trends, and what is the kind of persistent differences between the countries. And there are some differences which are very interesting. So. It's not optimal. So. It was going to get another. So I think it's maybe. It's going to start it. I can do this without the manuscript, but I have a lot of figures and things I would like to show. So. Okay, can you say a little bit about the 50s and 60s? The thing is that in the 50s and 60s, there were no immigration politics in this modern sense. People just arrived, they were work immigrants, and they were foreign workers. Okay, I can try. This doesn't help at all, no. So you can talk about a kind of non-political phase. people, not so many arrived. In Sweden, there was a lot of work immigration because the industry was still standing after the Second World War. So there's a completely different start after the war for the three countries. A lot of immigrants, a lot of Finnish immigrants also. And this kind of non-political phase, you can discuss how long this was, but in Sweden we think that this stopped earlier. But in 1965 you start to get the big institutions like Invandrarverket, and this was much later in other countries. So it has something to do with Swedish. There was a lot of immigrants arriving in Sweden. So the three countries are different there. In the 70s, things changed. And it has something to do with oil crisis, bad economic conjunctures, and those things. But you also have some kind of realization that we has to control it in some way. So there was an immigration stop in all three countries. You can discuss when they started. Maybe they started earlier in Sweden. But it just said we need a break. That was the terminology they were using. We need a break to some kind of organize. You have to prepare for these people coming. We just can't have them just arriving without any politics. So this is a start of immigration politics. This was a bit different paths. In Denmark, more focus on integration. In Sweden, also important integration into the labor force and into society, but also more focus on a kind of multicultural, let people live and be themselves. And this also be a very important difference in Swedish politics. And you have this kind of starts about, it's a kind of, as a social problem, you get this Danish Progress Party getting quite big in election in early 70s. This came later in the other countries. So in the 70s, you find, for example, in Norway, you find this kind of, this is called the spring of panic in Norway. This was in 71, when there arrived 600 Pakistani work immigrants, and suddenly they were kind of visible in the streets, and there was kind of what should we do with all these people? So it's something kind of qualitative, felt that something had to be done. And there was a lot of discussion. This is one of the earlier immigrants who came in these buses around to Norway. So it was this kind of double discourse about this is kind of becoming a problem, they're becoming many, but also we need these people. And much of the coverage of immigration is quite sympathetic to the immigrants in the 70s. So we have a lot of worry about people who get there, but they have a bad living quarters, they don't get work, how should they kind of survive? Because the state had no obligations to these people. That came later, so that's important. They were not seen as people did not worry about these being a kind of burden on society, because there was no economic help given to them. So many of these stories about sympathetic, they're following single immigrants, they're working, they're trying to support their family, but it's hard to find work, and they live in a very bad way and worry about the future. And some of them were kind of course, a kind of exotic interest in these new people who arrived. This is an Indian couple who are kind of celebrating Christmas in Norway. They want a Norwegian Christmas tree, and they also say that they want to make the food similar to Norwegian, but of course vegetarian. And they want to kind of embrace this kind of customs. And they say something that jula noe eget med seg. Christmas is something special. So they kind of, it's very heartwarming and very kind of positive vibes from this. But then you have these kind of worries. Who knows? There may be 10,000 immigrants in Norway in 10 years. So how will the society stand all this immigration? So something had to be done, and that was kind of immigration stop. Just to be very quick, in the 80s and 90s, you get more focus on refugees, because that was a kind of new phenomenon. Suddenly people arrived, and they can apply for asylum, and that was qualitatively different. This is Mao, so say something like, at some point, quantity becomes quality. Or it's Lenin who says that. And in Denmark, 1983 was 300 people arriving this way. And 2 years later, it was 9,000. So it became so big a phenomenon that they had to do something. They needed people to handle the applications. They needed some kind of housing politics. They needed some kind of education and work programs. So this meant that you had a lot of kind of politics oriented towards this. And it was combined with increasing unemployment. And you have this kind of, in Norway, '87 as a big breakthrough for the Progress Party. This kind of when immigration becomes a big political issue, the big political issue. Later, it's a more confused story. You have this kind of people suddenly when they discover that immigrants were permanent. In the 70s, you always expected that they would come and they would work for some years and then they go again. But suddenly, they're here. What do we do now? So the kind of family reunions has become a big issue. We suddenly have work immigration again with the EU eastwards expansion. We have a lot of events, which some maybe think have shaped maybe how people think about immigration. We have the Mohammed caricatures in Denmark. We have the Charlie Hebdo. We have in Sweden the murder of Fadime, which was a big case, a kind of honor killing, 2002. And you have discussions about this kind of the rights of the multicultural to have their own ways versus the rights of women, which will become a big issue. Yeah, and we also have in Denmark kind of similar immigrant critical parties. And there's still a lot of differences because this works so fine for just some seconds. For example, in terms of if you become a citizen, for example, in Denmark, I think you have to live there 9 years to become a permanent citizen. In Sweden, it's 4 years. It's always there in Sweden. You can take part in some kind of language studies to learn Swedish, but you can decide yourself if you want to. In Denmark, it's compulsory. So always this kind of there's some differences here, which seems that even if the societies are quite similar, they kind of walked some kind of different paths, and that is also we have some idea that the Swedes have been the kind ones, although this is kind of probably changing. You have Olof Palme said that Sweden is kind of a moral superpower. Denmark is kind of the strict ones. There was a big, I don't have this picture here, a immigration minister who celebrated. They have a 50th new law who make less appealing to immigrants to come to Sweden, and they're kind of celebrating with cake and hooray, it's more difficult to come into Sweden. So you kind of this is the kind of images we are thinking about when we hear about Denmark. And Norway is more kind of confusing. So that is some of the aim of this Bergen project we call SCANPUB, and we try to look at how this immigration debate have changed and how it's been different, because the societies was quite similar. We believe they were quite similar. So why did the immigration debate end in different ways in some way? Why is that? Why did it happen? So, and it's not just in the news, but it's also in this, also in literature, in television, in fiction, in comedy, and also in the discourses going on in science. So we have all this kind of trying to see how the debate have changed. So now I would really soon like some kind of signal, I think. Statistics, I can read the numbers, but it's maybe less appealing than... okay. I just... Yeah. This is... It's... I'm not really sure what... There's no logic to it.
Would it help to flip the iPad?
What, to flip it?
To flip it.
Is this a kind of... Yeah. My daughter. It seems that it wants to show my daughter, but not anything else. I can understand it, but maybe you not. I can try to flip it again. Just maybe this is a kind of super trick. No, it's not a super trick. Yeah. Nice big picture. Yeah. I'll just try one more time. Okay, so I think, okay, I have something. What I'm going to talk about is this first kind of question. Is a debate and press coverage of immigration in the Scandinavian societies different than the rest of Europe? Are we kind of kinder? Is it more kind of... there was some kind of natural experiment happening because you have this immigration, what you call a refugee crisis, as it's called. And lots of the press in Europe was kind of occupied with the same things. So then you can look at how the press wrote about things, what kind of themes, what kind of focus they had on this crisis, how to change. So this is really a project initiated by the LSE, Lille Shularaki, maybe as a name somebody people know. It's kind of distant suffering perspective. It's a big group in LSE, and we just kind of added the Scandinavian data. And of course, this was kind of a big issue, not just in the Syria and in the Greek countries, but it kind of became a big issue also in Norway and Denmark. There were scenes you haven't seen since the Second World War, people marching along the highways, which are kind of very arresting visual images. In this kind of European study, when we looked at articles in 3 periods, and you have some kind of hope, actually suffering part. This is the big drownings in 2015. That started early in the year. So you have and you also in September you have this Alan Kurdi incident, and there was a kind of lot of humanitarian appeal for aid. And then you have this Paris nightclub attacks again, and then it was kind of more fearful. The terrorist angle was more important. So there are some changes, but the important thing is that there are some differences between the countries. And the humanitarian narratives are much more common in Greek and the Scandinavian countries. And that is interesting because this is not so easy to see, but this is, if you think about all the articles, and we try to look at what articles are similar, and what kind of countries and what kind of themes they're working with, then you find that you have kind of 2 differences there. And one is some articles, they talk about political solution, what should we do, what kind of, they talk about the EU, they talk about kind of things to do to help the immigrants, solutions. And then you have some people, they're not writing about these things, they're just kind of writing 50 people drowned in the Mediterranean today. And that's it. There's no kind of connection to solutions and institution. This axis is more important. This is a kind of focus on all the problems which follows with the immigrants. So you have this kind of terrorists, this kind of economic refugees, big cultural problems, economical problems. It's a focus on the military, on the police. And then you have, especially kind of the Eastern European countries, have much more coverage in this way. Also UK has a lot of this coverage. And the kind of idea of these LSE researchers was that the further you got away from the suffering, the easier it was to have some kind of clinical view on it. Because it wasn't so close. So that you find Greece quite down here, focus on solutions, focus on humanitarian issues. There's kind of the images of refugees, the interviews with families, they talk with the volunteers. And that you should not be surprised you find this in Greece. But here's also you find the Scandinavian countries. So they're much more similar. So this kind of, the longer you go away, the less humanitarian the coverage is. It fits for most of Europe, but it doesn't fit for the Scandinavian societies. The Scandinavian newspapers are kind of spread out a bit, but still they're quite similar to each other. So I should not go into detail, but there is something, at least in 2015, there was some difference about the Scandinavian newspapers. And this is quite a broad selection, and the other newspapers. And so we're not really sure why that is. It can be traditions, it can be press traditions, it can be national traditions, but there's something. So it means that Scandinavia is maybe something of a special case. The second issue is about how this kind of developed in Europe. And I can be quite candid with you about the problems of doing this kind of statistical analysis of what kind of cases, what kind of articles, what the differences are. So I often have used this quote by Murakami. So he said, "Hell has no bottom." And there's really, if you want to do some kind of quantitative content analysis of these cases, immigration is probably the worst, the most difficult subject you can tackle. And there's no end to the problems you face. So state of the archives, for example, if you go beyond the 90s, they're not digitized, and even if they are digitized, you often look like something like this. If you search in the archives and do your fancy topic model, this is the basis for your topic model. This is how it looks in our text in the 70s. There's no warning about it. This is, if you are a researcher, please beware that some of these articles are not digitized properly. There are no warnings. So this is, if you go, even those things that are digitized are often very shockingly not good digitized. So it becomes very expensive. We have to do it all by hand. We have to read the newspapers, PDF or paper to kind of select the cases. It's also very hard to say that let's compare the press in Scandinavia, in Norway and Sweden, because you can compare opinions by kind of selecting 1,000 people in each country and say, okay, we have some kind of representative, but you can't do a representative sampling of newspapers because there are 50 newspapers, and you can't say that we take this newspaper and the exact same newspaper in Sweden. It's not possible. So what we did, some kind of one biggest broadsheet, one biggest tabloid, but you can't really do a kind of representative sample of newspapers. So what I think we have is some kind of the most Swedish newspapers in some kind of more humanitarian, Aftonbladet, Dagens Nyheter. We have some of the more critical newspapers in Denmark. We have Ekstrabladet or Jyllandsposten, a bit Politiken, and we have the Norwegian in the middle with VG and Aftenposten. So it's a kind of, I think what I will show you is some kind of a bit enlarged picture, kind of the Swedish and Danish, and they're bigger than they really are if you just make some kind of average of all newspapers in these countries. But it shows some kind of the dominant places for these debates in some sense. All these things. I was talking about everything I start talking about it. My project leader said that we don't want to hear about these kind of problems. We just want results. And that is a kind of common. People see these numbers for content analysis, and I feel that we see the truth. Here we have, there are 50% of this, 40% of this. And this is very, very hard. If you really do these kind of things, you have to be very, very, not cynical, but you are aware of the problems. So for example, young people in Sweden and Denmark are sitting and kind of looking at newspaper articles from the 70s and trying to say, is the theme of racism here in this article? And then think, okay, one thing is that they're young, and what was racism in the 70s is maybe something different than in 2010s, but it also is that, for example, I'm worried that maybe there'll be different thresholds, because maybe in Sweden you think that this is a racist issue, because the kind of discourse formation is different. But in Norway you don't think, you see the same case, but think, this is not a racist issue. So all of these problems it's kind of a reception study. We do these things. And also, of course, what is an immigrant, what is immigration debate, and all these things. So for example, in the 70s, immigration debate is also about asylum seekers from the Iron Curtain. This is a lot of debate in the 70s. It's not about Somali immigrants. It's about Eastern Europeans fleeing Soviet. You also have people. This is a kind of immigration debate in Trelleborg. I have no friends. Even I lived 18 years in Sweden, and this is also not a Somali immigrant. This is not him. This is a bureaucrat. It's a Finnish person. A lot of Finns and also Icelandic people were complaining about racism, that they were discriminated against. So this was also immigration debate. And somebody said that some of the reason the immigration politics in Sweden was quite inclusive and positive and open was because when you established these politics, a lot of the immigrants were Finnish people. They were culturally quite close. So this is kind of, are we still talking about the same things when we talk about Somali immigrants in the 2010s, or this is completely different phenomena? It's kind of hard. We're still talking about the same thing. Also, this kind of debate can be, of course, quite implicit, kind of discursive. For example, somebody writing about in '74 in Copenhagen, there come a lot of nice restaurants. We have a nice Pakistani restaurant here, and we have a nice Pakistan. The food was very good. Is this immigration debate, or is it not immigration debate? It is related to the discourse, but again. Also, a lot of these stories in the 70s is kind of immigration debate by proxy. You write about things happening elsewhere. So, of course, you write all about this kind of wars and refugees in other places, like you still do. But there's also a lot of discussion about South Africa. They are treating black people extremely badly. In England, they're treating them badly. In Denmark, they're treating them badly. In fact, a lot of news articles in the 70s is about what are Sweden doing, what kind of programs, politics are happening in Sweden and Denmark, because you knew this was going to be an issue. But so the immigration debate started especially in Norway, which was late, before immigrants came. They were kind of immigration debate by proxy. And of course, we have this kind of Romani people, Sami people. It's still related to the issue in some way. Otherness, integration versus assimilation. But this is not, I say, part of what I got to do. They've written some nice books about how it lives in Norway, about how Elisabeth Eide and people wrote about minorities in the press and how people look at the other world. So this is not what I'm going to do in this SCANPUB. We try to look more specific on debate, discussion about who's going to stay, who we're going to include. Is it bad that they come? What is good with they come? What is good? What should we do? All these things. So it's quite specific. We have a methodology report for people who are interested in that, but I will not go into. But just say, and now we're going to present some kind of the main changes. So it is about 4,000 articles, 6 newspapers plus Politiken. It's every year representative sample. Full reading. So people were reading the newspapers from start to finish, looking for relevant articles. We're not searching, but kind of term, look for immigrant Pakistani, which I think is a very horrible way to construct a sample, because this issue is so complicated. They can talk about immigration, but not use the word immigrants. So it's very hard to use for this kind of automatic samples. With 30,000 articles, and then we kind of subsample it, more strict about debate, and we couldn't code everything. But it was extremely costly, of course, for people reading these newspapers. And I don't dare to say what it costed, but it was expensive. And the problem with such projects is that people feel that because we used a lot of money of it, you want these results to be solid and questable, no problems with them. But they are full of problems. But that's the kind of nature of this kind of data. Okay. You probably notice the general lines. If you look at kind of immigration to Scandinavia, you have this spike, especially in Sweden, about the 80s and 90s. The kind of Bosnia is important, and then you have this rise and this kind of Syria conflict, and Sweden is generally more immigrants. You know this graph. If you look at the press, it looks quite similar. This is a number of articles in the 3 countries in the same period. So what you see is that the coverage kind of follows the events in some way. There come a lot of people from new backgrounds. There's a lot of discussion about how to tackle it, how to handle it, what should we do, and all it. So it's immigration coverage is to some extent dependent in external events, at least in kind of the major. There's some differences between the countries, but largely the same picture. One thing what does happen is that more and more in newspapers it changes from being kind of news items to being debate. So, for example, in Norway, how about in the 70s, 80% of all were kind of strict news items. They were not columns, not op-eds, they were not editorials, such things. And this goes down. So it's now the majority is debate articles. And that says something about kind of issue has become important in the public debate, the salience of the issue. But still, there are some differences. For example, in Sweden, there are very, very few letters to the editor, but a lot of columns. And that may be, someone has said that the Swedish debate is more dominated by intellectuals and politicians than in the other countries. It maybe had to do something about what kind of letters they wanted to accept in the newspapers. It's hard to know. But still, there's some kind of difference there, which is interesting. This is the kind of total for the countries. I think, okay, we talk more about religion in the later years. I mean, talk not so much about foreign workers, because that is a kind of concept which we don't use it anymore. We talk about asylum seekers, refugees. But one interesting thing is that if you look at categories who are present in the text, there can be an image or they talk about. There were a lot of males in the 70s, and there were more males here in the 70s because they were work immigrants and their families were away, and you have quite few females. But this kind of gap is still here, even if there now are just as many females, maybe more females, and then the male immigrants. But still, there's much more material in the press about male immigrants. So there's kind of a gender gap which is quite resistant. I think it's kind of interesting. Of course, who they talk about in this period. Of course, they talk about Yugoslavia and they could talk about Syria and Somalia. But it's a kind of it is related to the number of immigrants coming, but it's also a kind of combination of the number and kind of the need to politically tackle them, the debate going on. So Somalia, it's a lot of talk about Somalians, but much less about Polish people, even if there were more Polish people in Norway than in the Somalis. So it's not just kind of reflecting the immigrants who's here, but it's kind of combination of things. Here is a little, also a kind of main finding, I think, and that is, if you talk about who's talking, who is quoted in these kind of articles, you said that in 70s, you have immigrants were quite often quote, one of the much more than any other groups, and this is kind of fallen. But what has really risen is national politicians. So, and there's a link between, you have the National Civil Service in the 70s. There were kind of local people, bureaucrats in Oslo saying, this is how we're going to tackle housing and such things. And then more and more national politicians are kind of moving to the forefront, and they are the ones who talk most about it. So the theme, the area has become politicized, and it become kind of central in the political debate. We knew this, but it kind of been a very steady rise in most countries. Also, this kind of experts are more commonly quoted now than before, and also kind of media, intellectuals, Rollnes, those kind of people are more often quoted. And you have less of the kind of NGOs and such. So this kind of politicization is a kind of trend in all countries, and it's kind of become more and more important. What do they talk about in the news? Well, I think there's a lot of focus that religion has become more and more a kind of an issue. And that is true. As religion, you talk more about religion, you talk more about kind of customs, the customs of people, cultural differences, and you talk about racism. But a lot of things you talk about it's quite stable. It's about how many should we take in, how many should we not, what kind of people should we take in, and not. This kind of arrival and return of immigrants is a quite persistent themes. So it's not just kind of turned about religion, even if that is important differences. Here is some kind of differences between countries. If you look at Sweden, you get this kind of racism as a theme. It's very, very high for most of the period. If you look for Denmark, you have some discussion about racism as a theme in the 80s, but then it just drops out of the picture. There's almost no talk about racism. So in Denmark, you have this talk about integration in the whole period, as a high focus on integration problems. There's little in Sweden, become more and more and more, and in Norway it's also kind of doesn't fit in anything. It's kind of just in the middle and not very dramatic in any way. Religion also, much more discussion about religion in the later times in Denmark, much more often theme than in Sweden, a bit more in Norway. So there are some kind of differences here, which seems important, and it kind of, I think it sounds a bit like people have described the differences between the countries, that is kind of focus on racism in Sweden versus kind of integration in Denmark, and it seems that this is still. So this book by Hilmar, they said that a book about how workers became Muslims, this was the focus, and it's true in one way. It was about workers and, okay, +2 because technical problems, maybe. But it's maybe more true for Denmark because it's not this focus on religion. It's been more important there. So this is framings. So again, the focus on people who are victims in the news, very high, stable in Denmark. In Sweden, in Denmark, it's not less focus, but it's focused on kind of the threat, the problems, economic problems, social integration and so forth, and very little about this in the Swedish press. So there are kind of persistent historical differences in the three countries. I could also show, I think I have to move on. I'm going to show a bit of analysis about what kind of the differences are between the countries. This is based on a list of subjects and a list of sources for articles and the framing and the genre and the decade. And you try to look up if articles are similar using something called multiple correspondence analysis. So I'm not going into the quantitative, just kind of try to establish some kind of big patterns. And the big patterns is that if you have some kind of axis here where you have this problematizing part, articles, threat, the problems, economic problem, crime, versus the kind of positive heroes, immigration, and you have this some kind of the work, the welfare, integration into educational systems versus a more cultural debate, racism, identity, how is media talking about these things. And what you see is that you have some kind of movement for the Scandinavian countries where we go away from this focus on the workers, the plights, versus this kind of cultural debate, and partly a meta debate. So it looks a bit like this. I try to make some clustering analysis of making 7 kinds of immigration stories, which kind of broad categories. Racism and neglect, you have which is both direct racist, but also some they are not having happy lives because of us or in our country. So it can be anything. It doesn't need just to be racism. And this has been less a case in Denmark. So you see here, this is kind of gone down. The threat of religion and culture has also become much more pronounced in Denmark, it seems like. And also this kind of integration, the problem of integration, is persistent in Denmark and is much less in Norway and Sweden. We are not so. We don't look so. I think a lot of the discussion is that we are Sweden is very, very different. But in this data, at least the kind of the broad level about what they're talking about, the general themes, Sweden and Norway are much more similar. And Denmark is the one stand out. Terrorism. Yeah, it's in there because that is strange because if you look at individual arguments, specific arguments, and people, maybe letters to the editor, Politiken sounds a bit like VG, Aftenposten, and the Swedish newspapers. They're much more similar. I could show something like that, but I'm going to use 5 more minutes because of technical problems. It's okay? Yeah. This is if you only look at the letters to the editor, and this is a kind of, you try to look at which are generally more positive, which are kind of more usually negative, and then you have this kind of Ekstrabladet Jyllandsposten is clearly very different to all other newspapers, but Politiken is much more similar to that.
So that's my point. So if you only use Ekstrabladet and Jyllandsposten.
Yeah, the thing is that if you look at I'm not sure if I have it, but it's interesting because I also expected to find this. And I think it's true on a kind of argument level. It's very true what you're saying. But if you look at themes, you find that Politiken is usually talking about the same things and with quoting the same people as Ekstrabladet Jyllandsposten. So it means that it's kind of a news agenda, national news agenda, with everybody had to talk about these things. But the way they talk about it, in a more nuanced way, it's probably more different. So that is the kind of the limits of this kind of broad overview of changes. So it's agreed. So I have a more detailed things, but I'm just going to take some recap. So that's the first one. It looks like we're more humanitarian, less problematic stories, but we don't know how far back this goes. It was a special case. I think maybe Scandinavians are kind of rescuing people at sea and these things are kind of in the national DNA, but maybe it was just a war somewhere. Maybe not so different. Salience, more stories, more debates, national politicians, experts, intellectuals. It also become problematizing, cultural, reflexive. We talk more and more and more about the debate itself, how the debate works, how we should debate these things. I think there's a kind of Denmark. Denmark is the one who's really shifting. So in this kind of big space about issues and themes and what they're talking about, you have this kind of Sweden and Norway, they're kind of moving here. They're moving from this kind of heroes and working life things and a bit towards the kind of debate about culture, the problems of integration. Denmark has this movement. It's much movement, and it moves, the changes happen sooner. So it seems that already in the 70s, this is a kind of big discussion, is this something happening in the 80s, in the 90s? But at least in these data, Denmark was different already in the 70s. And it had become more and more different. So if you looked at Jyllandsposten, Politiken, it follows the quite general movement. So, yeah, so Denmark stands out. It's also some kind, maybe it's a paradox because people in opinion surveys are becoming more and more positive to immigrants, but the press coverage has become more and more problematized. So it has something with I think with this kind of theme moving into the political field and becoming central in the field with some kind of drives the images. But okay, thank you for your time and sorry about the technical issues. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the rich data. I wish you could show us some of the other things.
Yeah.
All right, so now we open the floor for questions. So, yeah. Who would like to start first? Yeah. Okay. You can use it if you
Okay.
like to.
Yeah. So this question is a little bit concerning methods as well, and I'm just curious. I don't know the newspaper landscape in Denmark very well, so I was just wondering why if these two newspapers kind of methodologically is difficult, why you chose them, and I am interested in, you have this picture about themes in the news. Where you had all these, and I have been working with migration in Germany, and I was just curious about the words, these themes, if they were, you selected them as like prisms, or if they came up in this kind of content analysis that you did, because I was curious about words like in Germany they talk a lot about sustainability and demography and those things when they discuss migration, and so yeah, I was just curious about these words.
Good questions. I often say that content analysis is for people who are either stupid or lazy. I prefer both because you see all these problems. And I think that's, we just take the kind of biggest broadsheet and the biggest tabloid, and it was in some way a mistake because you should maybe have taken Politiken, but Politiken again is another newspaper than Aftenposten, a little bit different. So, but what we include the Politiken later as a control. So you can see some kind of changes, but the main trends in Denmark, I think it's covered a bit because of this. These newspapers are kind of different. At the same time, they are kind of dominant in the Danish discourse, important reference for politicians. So I think that these results kind of show this kind of, not extremes, but the most, as I said, most Danish parts of the discussion and the most Swedish part, humanitarian versus the most critical part of the discourse. So that is a problem. I think it would be better to include Politiken, but we would have had other problems then again. So I think including more newspapers, and we have some in 2015 at least, we have much more newspapers. So you can compare and see something, but if this is true for 2000 and 1980s, also nobody knows. Yeah, it's not similar. So they were a better match for those. Aftenposten is a bit not too good about this. So this has been a big discussion and problem. About these themes, it's a mix because we had all these articles. We kind of read through a lot of articles and tried to find themes. But the thing is that sustainability, for example, we didn't find it. I don't think it's a lot of it, but we didn't do a very systematically some random sampling of issues and then try to find them. We didn't do that. Now, maybe it could have turned out, but I think I would be kind of surprised if that was an issue in Norway until later. Yeah, but I think it's a good point because the Green parties are much more open to immigration and all these things. So yeah, I'm not sure if I have.
All right. Who else would like to? Yeah. Yeah. You want to go? Okay. Thank you.
I was just wondering, what sort of struck me, since I work with irregular migration, is that how high theme legal, what do you call it, return policies and legal entry or something is one of the highest themes, while, for instance, yes, and in another one you had the issue of foreign workers being a theme that almost disappeared. And it's interesting because working with irregular migration, it's a quite small number, while workers from Eastern Europe is a very high number. And it's quite interesting that the way your result that the media doesn't really discuss, or is that, would you say that this is, because you use these words, so I guess you would have sort of got the data if it had been an issue at all. So it's say it's a theme that isn't.
We do have this as a specific category coding. I think it's quite small. It was something in the 80s maybe and early 90s, but it's very small. I have the numbers. I can send them to you.
Yeah, because it's interesting that it's so absent in a way.
Yeah.
Well, the number of migrants is
this
hasn't anything to do with the phenomena, like the size of the phenomena. In a sense.
This is just because I selected some kind of 10 interesting issues from a list of 30. So it's there, but I think it's quite small and it's interesting. But I find the numbers. So maybe if you can use it.
I just found it,
That is also, if other people maybe want these numbers or something, we have a report with some of these tables at least. So you have to take them for what they are. So they're the best guess until a better guess come along.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful presentation. 2 quick questions, basically. First, connected with your question, was there, since you were checking, the immigration debate between the 3 countries, was there any specific focus on educated and experienced immigration versus refugees and non-educated immigration? Did you notice any difference? And the second one is, you also mentioned the rise of citations from local governments. Do you include like Kommune or institutions like NAV, who are like explicitly working with, immigration's consequences?
They included the last one. They included the kind of local civil service, and we had national civil service. I just thought it was interesting because there was a present theme in the 70s and also 80s. They were kind of people who were doing this kind of practical stuff, and then suddenly kind of politicians took over more and more. And now they say that we are only asked to say something if it's a negative issue. If it's a positive issue or it's kind of problematic thing for the politicians, then they want Invandrarverket to come and say something. If there's kind of a good thing for the party, then the politicians come and say it. So there's a kind of discussion about this. The first question was about, what was the first question? Because remind me,
It was about the focus on educated.
Education. We have a lot about education as a theme, but much of it is about the kind of integration we need to get. People are dropping off, and this is leading to crime, or people don't know the language, a lot of these things. But there's distinctions between immigrants who are kind of are educated or not. We don't have this coded, so I don't think we can say anything about it.
Where did you mentioned in Denmark, it's more debates about the crime rate and like radical kind of discussion. Is it the same? Is it connected basically with what you said now?
It's
That in Denmark, it's mostly in Denmark that we see those kind of debates? Or?
It's a more important theme in this kind of the kind of negative, but it is in all countries. It's just more dominant. It's more often you find these things in the Danish material. So that is.
Thank you. Thank you for a really interesting presentation, I think. I just wondered if you have seen anything about or looked at all about the relations between this and, for instance, changes in public opinions or policies. So have you looked or thought about like the consequences of this changing?
Yeah.
Thanks.
we are working on this kind of analysis. The thing is that it's not a big material, and I think it's quite easy to do that for maybe 2010s and further. It's very difficult when it comes to about 80s and 70s and not so many cases. But we are doing this kind of analysis, I think, which is kind of time series regression tests, and see if we can get any idea that if opinion follows coverage, or if coverage follows opinion changes, and these things, and kind of looked at it. But I don't have any good answers. But we're doing these things. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you've looked at how these, if we look away from the op-eds and stuff, if you look at the news, how are they classified? As local news or as international issues?
Yeah. I think we have this category, but I don't think we have really looked at it very much because we took away these kind of things happening in Africa and in Syria, but we wanted to have things happening in Europe. So it's more focused on the national level. I don't think we looked at that yet local, but it's a good idea to have a look. I would expect them to be difficult. The problem is that VG is some kind of also a local newspaper for Oslo, but remember Jyllandsposten, we don't have a kind of local newspaper for Copenhagen in the same sense. So they have some kind of different issue, focus on the local issues maybe. So, yeah.
Yeah, right. I was just wondering if you have seen any direct correlations between international conflicts and immigration debates, as we have like more speaking about immigration debates in times of conflict, like 1979 in the Iranian Revolution. I just noticed that table earlier.
Yeah.
Are you using that in your format? In the models?
Yeah, of course. We're looking at kind of big events and the number of immigrants who have come, if there was an election at that year, and such variables, opinion data. But the problem with opinion data, that you don't have comparable opinion data in Scandinavian before 2002, I think. Before that, there's almost nothing. So it's very hard to do something for a longer run. So, but we were trying to implicate that in the models, yes. But for me, it kind of looks intuitive, like it's connected to the kind of big wars and refugee surges. And also, for example, in populism, how often you find this kind of populism discourse, it's kind of very high here around the 90s, and then it's kind of go down later. So it also kind of, especially this kind of 90s and 80s, looks to me like a kind of very important period in the formation of all things in the immigration debate. So.
On a second question, not related to this, but you showed earlier an example of a-text,
yeah.
The Norwegian newspapers, right?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you're also using Nasjonalbiblioteket, because in my experience,
yeah, that's better.
It's a lot better, especially in the 70s and 80s, because you can, especially on VG and Aftenposten, you literally have every newspaper they have, even on day, often and Morgenavis.
I think,
in Artex,
yeah.
I used this even earlier today also.
Yeah.
I had the same problem.
Yeah.
To go into
I haven't seen the new. That is good news. If the problem is also that many of the newspapers, some newspapers, at least in Sweden and Denmark, they're not digitized before the 90s, or they have the special system. And if you want to do television, it's much worse, because what you'll find if you look for you find a documentary program, call this kind of another Copenhagen by night, and then you just find a list that said that there was every Tuesday in these 10 years Copenhagen by night, and that is the information you know in the archives. You don't know anything about them. You have to go in and watch every program and try to classify them. So, and the commercial television station, they don't want to give you the documentaries or programs because there may be some rights issues about this. And NRK is now talking about rights issues, that maybe you don't get free access to all these kind of old immigration programs. So this will be maybe an even bigger problem for us now. But television has been a nightmare. And that was because we should have included Dagsrevyen and this kind of important news, but it was very, very hard to do. So people are working with it more qualitatively. But it's good news if it's becoming better. Yeah.
But it's harder to get access to. They had last year, they had a free access for everybody with a PAIDA in Norway. Right now, they took it away for 3 months ago, so you have to search the libraries for only 1 and 2 days access. So that's the problems I've heard about now. But by guidance, he said that if you are a professor full time, you could get full access all the time.
Okay.
Which I assume you are.
Yeah. Okay. This is new. We know that things are happening in Norway, but always the problem is this is a good solution for the 90s and 20s, but for the 80s, probably everything breaks down and you don't have the material anymore. But I think you can maybe do a lot of the things that I'm doing more automatically in a few years' time. So I think. But still, again, lots of these topic modeling models, they're based on search words. And I become very critical to search words. You want to know what is written about Olof Palme. You can search Olof Palme and you find everything that's written about Olof Palme. If you want about the immigration debate, there's no end to the search terms you need to write. It's very, very hard to kind of mechanically say that this is immigration debate, this is not immigration debate. It sounds very appealing to do it, but I think it's almost impossible to do it in a good scientific way. You need some kind of human study afterwards.
Just that maybe you mentioned it in the beginning, but I find it interesting that you're not, searching for specific terms in the database. And then I'm wondering, when you're not doing that, then how do you, what criteria do you use to define the time period of the search? So why did you start with the post-war?
Yeah, 70s.
Yeah, or 70s, yeah, so why not before?
I think it was a bit arbitrary. It was some kind of idea that there wasn't any immigrants in Norway before 71. It's not completely true, but there was probably more people in Sweden. So it was some kind of the modern immigration phenomenon maybe started in the 70s, and they knew there was this kind of immigration stops, and they started formulating politics. But why you didn't? I think that because they changed so much, at least in Denmark, are so different already in the 70s. That means that you should have looked at the 60s. Maybe, and maybe you can find some differences longer back. So it's not a good answer, but I'm not sure. I think for some things you should look at the 60s at least, maybe even 50s. But for some parts about how do people tackle this kind of others who are very culturally different, maybe you can start in the 80s, because then you have kind of there are bigger numbers of them. They're more present. There's more discussion about it. So it kind of depends on the view, but. I think 70s is too late and too early for different things. Yeah.
I was just wondering if your data supports an assumption of a qualitative shift in basically the discourse to a more populist view now.
Yeah, populism. Yes, we wrote an article about this. And that was kind of Denmark, very much populism. And I think, I don't have it here. So it suggests this kind of cultural shift towards more religion, culture, identity discussion about who are we, who are they, what kind of society are we. There is some kind of quality shift, but it seems that it is much stronger in Denmark. In Sweden and Norway, it's not so pronounced. It's still there. But I think it supports this idea, yes. So,
Any other questions?
Okay, I have a question myself. If you don't have any other questions, so, like at the peak of the so-called crisis, like what differences are there between the Scandinavian, like what makes the Scandinavian press actually any different from like any other kind of press in Europe in terms of how they covered this so-called crisis? Because you said that like the Scandinavian press tends to be more humanitarian in that regard. But I think at the peak, more or less, most of the countries like tended to cover the situation in more like they tended to cover the situation from this perspective more or less, right? So there hasn't been so much differences in that sense, or
the thing is, I think it's important because things is happening. Right? You had this kind of drownings, and you have this the boy Alan Kurdi, and then you have this Vatican. But if you look at how these people, this country moves, you see something like this. It's a little. They move a little bit. Alan Kurdi, Vatican. Alan Kurdi, Vatican. Most countries they don't move very much, so it's quite stable in the period. The thing is that I think it's true. There is some kind of, I'm not sure, April, July, November, September. There's some kind of movement for all towards this more humanitarian. So that is correct. But the thing is that still, even in the most discussion of the terrorism in Paris, the Norwegian press has less focus on terrorism. There's more still focus about the refugees, the plights, the interviews with families who are now arriving, the pictures of them. The kind of, I think still there are some kind of, if you call it humanitarian, but you can call it almost a kind of tabloid interest in people's ordinary lives. Maybe it's less political than maybe, for example, Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung is very much, this is happening at the EU, this happened today, this was a new law, but Norwegian and it's more kind of a tabloid language, which is, for many, it's kind of a negative thing, but it means kind of pictures of people suffering, personal stories, and this kind of, that is also adopted by the broadsheets. So it can have also something about the newspapers, because in Scandinavia you have more this kind of schizophrenic newspapers where newspapers are kind of high quality political discussion, but also this tabloid language. In the other countries you have this kind of separation between the Sun and what's it called, Daily Mirror. That's not a good example, but between kind of quality versus tabloid issues. So I think it's still, I'm not sure what you could call humanitarian, but it's kind of interest in these people's lives and suffering. I think it's more pronounced. But we have this NGO. We have a lot of Norwegians and Swedes are working there. We have a lot of tradition of this interest in these NGOs. Maybe it's connected to this kind of aid perspective. I'm not sure. Because a lot of the immigration debate, also in the 70s, was about should we help people where they are. That is not a new debate. It was about should we give this money to these people or should we let them come to us. So I'm not sure why, but I think there still is some kind of differences there.
All right. Okay. Great. Okay, so we'll end the discussion here. Thank you so very much for coming, and yeah. So thank you also for the presentation.
Thank you for your comments. We're kind of trying to understand these results and what it really means. So it's, I'm still not sure, but I think that there are some patterns that are interesting, and it's consistent enough that I think that there are something here and there are some trends. I trust that the small differences are maybe harder. So it's a difficult issue to research. Okay, thank you very much. Sure.